Inflation is being recorded at 5.5%, and salaries aren't keeping pace. But what is inflation, and why should you care? Stay until the end of the video to find out. Inflation measures the gradual rise in goods and services in the economy. There are many ways to measure it, but for the purposes of this video, we're only going to talk about CPI, which stands for Consumer Prices Index, and RPI, which stands for Retail Prices Index. I'll explain how both are calculated in a moment, but first, inflation is almost impossible to control. In the 1970s, in a decade-long event called the Great Inflation, we saw an inflation rate above 24%, which means that in that year, prices rose on average by 24%. Scary stuff. Inflation rates were about double-digit levels for almost a decade, from 1972 till about 1982. In the UK and the USA, it was mostly caused by a number of large events, such as the dollar being taken off of the gold standard and a significant rise in oil prices due to global tensions. If inflation is too high, the value of your wages quickly erode. Any debts and savings you have quickly become worth less, and planning for the long term becomes almost impossible. When inflation is low, your money's value is kept at a reasonable level, and people like you and I have a good level of confidence about the future of prices in the economy and can plan for the future. That means things like saving to buy a car, saving to buy a house, rather than needing to go into debt for it. But if inflation is too low, this can suggest that there isn't enough demand for goods and services. The worst possible situations that could occur are stagflation, where you have high inflation and low economic growth, and deflation, where there is negative inflation. Frankly, these deserve videos of their own, so I'll leave these for another time, because they can turn out to be incredibly complex situations in their own right. This is more of an overview of the basics of inflation and how they're calculated. Inflation came back to levels that we aimed for in about 1993, and in 1994, I was born. Coincidence? I think not. But things are starting to get a little hairy again. Since the pandemic, despite my calming presence, we're seeing a rapid increase in the monthly inflation rate from where we have been for years, below about 2%, to over 5% recently, with the Bank of England's estimates guessing that it will reach about 8% before inflation begins decreasing again. For those of us who aren't aware, the UK aims for an inflation rate of around 2%. This is deemed to be sufficiently high to encourage people to spend their money rather than holding it, for fear of its value eroding, but low enough for people to be able to save for large purchases without fear that they'll never be able to afford it due to the erosion in the value of their cash that they've saved. Okay, so let's move on to how you calculate each of these methods of measuring inflation. Now, obviously I'm not going to go into too much detail because that'd be boring, but it's important that you understand roughly which one contains which. So the contents of each calculation are reasonably similar for both CPI and RPI. For CPI, a survey is done. Out of that survey, 650 goods and services are identified, and then the government decides the percentage of our income that we end up spending on that good or service. What they then do is they make up a basket of goods and services with those percentage weightings coming to us spending all of our income, and they compare that to prior years. Obviously, there are issues with comparing this data to prior years because the basket of goods may change year on year, as may the weighting. So to make things more complex, we may change our spending habits more quickly than the government harvests our data, causing inflation to be less accurate. Say, for example, with the pandemic, where we found ourselves working from home for an extended period of time, the things that we were buying were fundamentally different than if our lives looked like normal. All of this makes the comparison of inflation with prior years, other countries, and anything else you want to compare it with really difficult. It is at best a finger in the air just supported by data. So it's very difficult to make sure that this is actually an accurate number. It's very unlikely that this is going to be representative of your individual situation. RPI is similar, but it contains mortgage interest costs, house prices, and council tax in the basket of goods. Sadly, it's not quite that simple though. The method of calculation is fundamentally different between CPI and RPI. So even though these measures may very well be calculated in a similar way, the physical calculation that a mathematician does is different. So they will not be comparable with each other despite the fact they're generally shown with each other. RPI in recent years has been widely discredited and is due to be replaced by a new measure called CPIH. It essentially means Consumer Prices Index with housing. But I intend to do a video explaining this change in the future. Okay, so let's have a look at how the government controls inflation. As we've said, inflation is impossible to control. There are simply too many things that impact it. But there are a number of things that governments can do. Raising the interest rates is one of the most high profile at the moment, with the Bank of England raising the base rate from 0.5% to 0.75% in March, and signalling that further rate rises may be on the horizon this year. Raising interest rates tends to make saving money more enticing and borrowing money more expensive, although with the paltry rises that we're seeing at the moment, it's unlikely that these effects will be significant enough to affect the level of inflation that we're seeing. Central banks can also raise taxes or lower government spending to take money out of our pockets, which means that we would not be able to bid up the prices of goods or services. What you'll typically find is that with demand pull inflation, if you have a significant amount of disposable income and you want something like a house prices rise because for the most part, you're not alone in your prosperity. All governments can create competition within markets to force established players to offer goods and services at a lower price and force them to compete. However, keeping inflation under control may not be in the government's best interest at the moment. Remember that we've created nearly £550 billion of money since March 2020 through quantitative easing. And if I were to compare the national debt in September 2019 against the debt in September 2021, I find that it's risen from 1.8 trillion to 2.2 trillion. That's about £400 billion in debt. Theoretically, high inflation of the pound makes this debt worth less in real terms. That said, the Bank of England doesn't want inflation to be out of control. That could cause a lot of damage, and it could go some way to explaining the lies that we were told about inflation being transitory at the beginning of the year. Okay, so let's talk about companies. Now, companies are in a really difficult position in times of high inflation. They'll be under a lot of pressure from their investors to generate consistent returns, whether that be in the form of dividends or a rise in the share price, but they're also faced with the need to be good corporate citizens by treating their staff, customers, and those around them fairly. This isn't because they're good people. It isn't because they believe in a greater good other than profit. It's because they're planning for the future. Companies are incorporated for an unlimited period, and so a short-term mentality causes companies to fail. They are waiting for the good times to roll around again, and for you to remember how good you were to them in the bad times. Okay, so I hear you asking, Andy, that's great, but why do I care? What does that have to do with me? It really is as simple as this. The pound itself does not have any value. It's only valuable when it can buy something. If inflation is high for a prolonged period of time, the value of your salary will in real terms decrease, because you'll be able to buy less with it. This works in reverse for people who own assets though. If you own real estate that pays you rent every month, when inflation is high, the value of the house is likely to increase. Now this happens because there are only so many houses, and the demand for those houses is fixed. But if the value of money decreases, the house is still worth the same amount, and so you need more pounds to buy the same house. This may very well positively impact the amount of rent that they can charge, resulting in an increase in income for them. Annoyingly, this results in a further increase in our costs. This is where the 9-to-5 job model that we were taught in schools falls down. Your employer is unlikely to give you an inflationary rise when inflation is 8% year on year, so you'll likely over time become poorer. If you, on the other hand, had bought a house or commodities or scarce assets, it stands to reason that you would notice an increase in your net worth over a period of higher inflation. The final nail in the coffin for people who work a 9-to-5 is that your savings will tend to decrease in value over a period of higher inflation, meaning you're not only likely to have less to put away, but what you put away will be worth less. And so you get into the unenviable position of saving every month to reach a goal and watching that goal get further away as you save. It's frustrating, right? It's not all doom and gloom though. If you were to have any debts during a period of high inflation, they may fall in value in real terms. This allows you the opportunity to increase your income, ideally in line with inflation, which would then be able to pay off your debt faster. Obviously, this only works if you're getting pay rises that bring you perhaps higher than you would have been if inflation were at 2% a year. If not, your wages and debt devalue at the same rate, and there's no benefit to be had. If this is the case, you may find it difficult to stay out of debt due to your expenses increasing while your wages don't, and that's a difficult place to be in. There are things you can do to combat periods of high inflation, but I'm not necessarily going to go into them in huge amounts of detail here because I do intend to do a separate video altogether. The rule of thumb is this: if there is a scarce resource that has robust demand and few viable alternatives, inflation will typically increase the value of this item. Not financial advice, because I'm neither qualified nor able to give it, but something to ponder in your free time. Okay, thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll leave links to the sources I've used putting this video together in the description below. If I've explained something poorly in this video, please comment and I'll be able to get back to you as soon as I'm able. And finally, please check out my other videos.